Hello, and welcome to another episode of Teaching with Madly Learning. This is week 3 of our summer literacy series, and I want to thank you so much for continuing to join the conversation, both here on the Madly Learning Facebook page, as well as within our Facebook group, Teaching with Madly Learning. So we have talked about what your literacy program can look like. We have talked about how to accommodate and modify for a variety of different students that are in your classroom. And this week, we're going to be focusing on what happens during that independent work time. Now, for me, independent work time takes up about 40 to 60 minutes of my 100-minute literacy block. So it's pretty significant. So if you are new to the show, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Patty and I'm a teacher in Ontario, Canada, and I come to you every single Monday night at 9, talking about teaching using inquiry, differentiation, universal design, and all things teaching from start to finish in the junior grades. So again, this week we are talking about independent work time. We're going to look at 6 different types of centers and how centers look a little bit different in junior grades, and we can use a variety of different modalities to figure out what those centers are going to look like. Center rotations are a little bit different in the junior grades. If you've been watching this show for a while, you'll know that I'm a big proponent of differentiation and inquiry-based instruction. So of course, some of my groupings are going to range from teacher-controlled to student-controlled, and we're going to look at all of the different variations of how you can run and rotate students through centers for independent work time so that you can get things done in your classroom while they're working. So first off, let's look at what centers are. So centers are the independent activities that your students are going to do. They're also going to want to have multiple activities that fit different learning styles if possible, or allow students some multiple entry points. And you're also going to make sure that these are activities that students can complete over a number of days. So it's not just a one-off activity that they're going to complete on a Monday, but centers are going to be activities that you're going to give them on, say, a Monday, and they will have all week to complete, and they will often rotate through these activities throughout the week. So why is it important to use centers in the junior grades? Because sometimes it feels like centers are a little primary, but I think that centers are a huge, effective tool to use in junior, especially because we as junior teachers need to get a lot done, and we have larger class sizes, and we need to be able to see and assess our students during this time while they are working independently on another task. So during this time, we use centers so that we can do guided reading. We use centers so that we can spend time as teachers conferencing with students about their writing or their reading ability. We use it because if they're engaged in centers, we have an opportunity to be engaged in formative assessment with our students, or even summative assessment. It's also a great time to do any testing. So if you have a reading test such as DRA, then that's a great time to be able to do that while your students are engaged in activity. You can be working with small groups or individual students. So we talked about the different types of centers. So I have six different types of centers, and I've put them in this matrix. So I want to talk about these first ones here. This is structured and open. So this is a continuum from structured to open. And in this section, we are really talking about the rotation schedule. So a lot of teachers think of centers as being a very fixed rotation. So you do center A, center B, center C, center D, and you have multiple groups and they just rotate through those 4 centers and spend the same amount of time on each center. In a structured rotation schedule, those are teacher controlled. So the teacher determines what the rotation is going to look like. Often in a structured rotation, there is a time limit, so students are engaged in one sustained activity for a set period of time, and the rotation is rigid, so they only have a certain amount of time to work on that center because they may not be revisiting that center later in the week. On the other end of that continuum is open. Now, this requires less control from the teacher. It is more flexible, and there's a lot more student control in what it is that they are working on and when. So it's less of a rigid rotation schedule. On the other side, you have fixed, flexible, and free. Now, these are talking about the groupings and how you group your students. So while the other top row is about your rotation schedule, this side of the matrix is going to be about center groupings. So for this side, you're going to be talking from fixed all the way to free. So again, it's a continuum. So for the fixed center groupings, these are teacher controlled. This is where you control who is in what group. You decide, and those groups don't change. So you will determine who they are. Maybe you are using a mixed ability grouping. Maybe you're doing an ability grouping, but the groupings are decided by the teacher and they don't change very often. Now, flexible groupings, where you have some groupings might be determined by the teacher, but they can be changing often. There is some shared responsibility with sometimes students may need to change in and out of groups. So it's not going to be, there's still amount of teacher control, but there's also some flexibility in that just because the student is in the red group week 1 doesn't mean they're going to be in the red group week 2, because maybe you're focusing on a different skill and you regroup your students more often. So if you're someone who wants to have a little bit more fluidity or flexibility in your student groupings, then that's where you would sit on the continuum. And then on the opposite end of the continuum, you have free center groupings. And this is where the students are more responsible for where they are and what they're working on. And there might not actually be any groupings in a free style, because the students are going to determine what they're going to work on when. So I want to go through each type of center and kind of give you a framework to understand how that might look in a classroom. And remember, you don't have to pick one of the 6. Sometimes you can kind of pick multiple depending on where you are. And it also doesn't have to stay the same all year long. You might start out with a fixed structured center rotation at the beginning of the year where you have far more teacher control. And as students progress through the year, you may move more towards a free open approach. And this is totally normal, and it will depend on both your comfort level as a teacher as well as your students' abilities. I would challenge you, however, to really look at your interpretation of what your student abilities are. Most often, we doubt that students are able to work in a free, open type of learning environment, and we worry and guess at what their reaction and behavior is going to be. But we can get them there. It does mean that we might have to put some constraints on around them, but we can move away from, say, a fixed and structured with most groups of students. So let's start there, the fixed and structured groups of students. A fixed and structured rotation schedule is the one that we're most familiar with as teachers. This is where the teacher makes the groups up and we make the rotation schedule, and every day during independent time, we rotate one of the two. So we either rotate the teams or the groupings, or we rotate the schedule. So this is a picture of when I had a classroom of 36 students, this was our 2-week rotation schedule. So every day, I would rotate the teams down one spot. And over a 2-week period, they would get enough time at each one of those centers. So these centers cards stayed the same. They never moved. And I rotated the group centers. Now, I always had an open section on my rotation schedule, and this allowed some flexibility. Because I was providing guided reading at one point in that 2-week rotation, I did want there to be some open time where if I missed a group for whatever reason, then I had time to catch up with that group when the open card came up to the top where it says conference with teacher. This is another example of a fixed and structured center grouping, and you will again notice that this is just with a smaller class, so it's a 1-week rotation schedule. Again, I'm not rotating the centers cards, I'm rotating my group cards. And although you don't see an open card, that blank spot beside Meet the Teacher is a open spot. Now, this generally will stay in my room. This is what I will most often start with, is a fixed structured rotation schedule. And as students get to know themselves as learners and get to know their abilities in language, we move away from this for some of them, and others will stay with this fixed rotation schedule longer throughout the year. So I do have the time where some students move beyond a fixed and structured schedule rotation, and then other students that just stay in this spot because that's what they need and that's what they're ready for. Next level down, we have the flexible structured. So this is where the teacher creates the groupings, but the groupings can change and flow, and the teachers select the rotation schedule. However, there is some flexibility in how the teacher might change it. So they might change the students in those groupings. So for example, this is one flexible structured form, is that these are level or groups 4, 5, 1, 2, 3. Those rotate through, but there's no names attached to those. So students can be moved in and out of those groups as needed based on how I've decided I want to group them. Because of that, I've also removed out the guided reading from my rotation. And the reason I did that is because I want to have mixed ability groups. For this particular group of students, I needed to have two separate groups, a mixed ability group to rotate through, and I also needed to have guided reading groups, which were ability groupings. So that's why you'll see things like catch up on the schedule, because that's where if they were pulled into a guided reading during, say, writer's workshop or work on words, then when they hit the catch up, they would substitute whatever they missed when they were coming to me for guided reading. So it's a little bit more flexible. I have the ability to have some students rotating through a schedule and have my guided reading groups completely separate. I can mix them up. I can change them up. If you have high needs or high behaviors in your class, you may want to group them this way because it allows you to change up the personalities that might be in the same group as one another and make sure that they are in different spots at different times, while also still being able to run your guided reading session where all of your friends might be in one guided reading group, which so often happens. So that means they're not all coming from different groupings. For some cases in your classroom, if you have, say, high needs or high behaviors, this flexible structured gives you the option of having some flexibility between how they rotate through versus how they come to see you for guided reading as well as conferencing, but it also allows you to have different groupings and group them in different ways for different purposes. So on this, we're going down this structured. So the next one down on that continuum is free structured. And this is where the teacher will select the rotation schedule and students are going to pick which rotational schedule is going to work best for them. So the students have some control, but they still have a rotation schedule that's a bit structured. They just get to decide which group they're going to go into. So for example, you have in this picture, you have side A and side B. So there's really only two options that students are selecting, but for some students, they may want to say work on words first and work on their reading response last, and then they might want to do reading to respond first. It depends on where they might be. But if you use student number cards, these cards will represent a different student in your classroom, and they can be either on side A or side B. So they have some choice as to what they're working on. However, it also means that you can hold them accountable for which group they're going to be in. So if you want to give them a bit more freedom, they can also say, if you're on side A, you can work on any one of those activities, and maybe you can take out one row and say just it's work on words and writing, and the other one is writing and reading response. And if you want to give them more freedom, they can choose which side they go to. and what they're working on, but they have to work on everything in that column. So they can't work on the other one. They have to choose that, say, the next day. But that's another way that you can add a little bit more freedom and what maybe that rotation chart might look like if this is the strategy you're going with. Now, on the other end of the continuum, we're going to be giving them a little bit more control when it comes to the rotation schedule. And that's where we see the open type of centers. So in a fixed groupings, but an open rotational schedule, teachers are going to determine the groupings, but the groups will decide on their own rotation schedule. So for instance, you can decide what the groups are. So you'll see that there's yellow sticky notes there beside the blue group. You could write your students' names on those sticky notes, and then students have the ability to choose in that center whether they're going to do A or whether they're going to do B. And they can make that choice as to which one they're going to do first, and then say the next independent work period during that day, they can pick the other one. So they have some choice as to what it is they're working on. However, you've decided what group they're in and what their limited choices are. So you're giving them some choice as to what they're going to do first and what they're going to do second, but you're still giving them some fixed schedule there that they can follow. So by the end of the week, they've gone through all of your centers activities, but each day they do get a choice as to one or the other, which one they're going to work on. Now, the next level down on the open category is going to be flexible open. Now, this is a type of centers rotation where students are going to choose what center they're going to work on based on the need that they have, and then they're going to stay within that center for a fixed amount of time. So for example, you have your 4 centers activities, your readers workshop, respond to reading, work on words, and another writing workshop, because you want to do a lot of writing. So in this example, I would be rotating the cards down, or I would allow students to change their center every day. I wouldn't let them move between that 20 minutes. So if I'm giving them 20 minutes of independent work time, they're going to choose their center for that 20 minutes, and they have to stay at that center for 20 minutes. And then perhaps the next center, I might rotate the cards down 1, and then the students will do that second activity. Or you can also, for the second 20 minutes, allow them to reselect what they're working on, but they have to stay for that entire 20 minutes working on the activity that they picked. So they must sustain that choice. So even you want them to really be working on that and kind of manage their time. Instead of floating in between multiple activities within a 20-minute period, you're going to, or 20 to 30-minute period, you're going to have them decide this is what they're working on for this set amount of time, and they're going to stay sustained at working at that activity for that independent work period. And then the next independent work period they have in the day, so a 30-minute and a 30-minute, then they can reselect their activity, or the teacher could just rotate the card and they stay with the second activity that's been determined. So it gives them some choice about what they're working on, but it does constrain them a little bit in the sense that they can't just flip from one activity to another. They have to sustain that independent work time that entire time. Now, the complete opposite of, say, what we might traditionally think of centers is going to be the free open. Now, this is always my goal as a teacher, is to get my students to the free open, or at least some of them to the free open, because I think a lot of them can handle it, and you might have some that still need to stay on that structured or have some more structure. But if I can get a lot of my students working on the free open, then it's completely tailored to what they need as a student, which in my mind is always going to be great if I can absolutely meet the unique demands of each one of my students. So in a free open, the students are going to choose what activity they want, and they're going to switch as they need it. So this is an example that I've pulled from math. These are my 4 math centers, and students are able to choose which math center that they go to and what they complete. They do need to have each math center completed, and before they do a hands-on activity, they need to have at least done one other activity first before they can flow into the hands-on. So in a day, if they want to finish off their work period with a hands-on activity, they have to at first have tried one of the other centers. Now, another example from literacy of a free open looks very much like the flexible open, except it's a little bit different in the fact that there's no rotation. Here, students will put their card where they're working, and when they change what they're working on, they will go ahead and move their card. So there's no structured rotational schedule here, except the students determine their own rotational schedule. In fact, I've had some students that will design their own individualized schedule that they themselves hold themselves accountable to be able to complete in a week. So I've had some students that really like to front load their writing and get their writing done at the beginning and then save Friday for some of the spelling and grammar work. I've had other students that do the complete opposite, where they want to get their reading response, their word work done on the Monday, so they have the rest of the week to really focus on writing. And then I have lots of students that are in between that just like to pick multiple activities that they can complete in a day, because sustaining independent work at one activity for some students is difficult. So they like being able to do 10 minutes of one activity, 10 minutes of another activity. And they'll often change even locations in my classroom because they need to kind of change it up for themselves in order to actually work independently. They want to not always be working on the same activity. So when you're using a free open strategy, you can meet the needs of those variety of students. The students that want to front load, the students that want to save everything to the end, and the students that need to bounce in between different activities. Now, that doesn't mean that it's a complete free-for-all. And of course, you're going to have the students that want to take advantage of this freedom at the beginning. Now, one of the things that I do is we spend a lot of time talking about time management, responsibilities. We also will talk about the concept of eating the frog, which is talking to students about look at the things you have to do. What is going to be the hardest thing or the thing that you dread doing the most? That's the thing you should do first, because then you get it done and over with, and then you can move on to an activity that you enjoy more. So that it's not that they just avoid that activity because they don't want to do it, but that they get it done first. So we talk a lot about time management, and we do have students that struggle to manage their time. And sometimes the best way to learn how to manage your time is to try and fail and need to modify and change and grow and learn how to come about managing your time. It is such a vital tool for a junior student to learn how to manage their time because they're still pretty moldable. And it's an essential skill once they hit middle school and high school that they are able to manage their time. In a home distance learning where we might be flipping back and forth between in-class, hybrid, or fully digital online, the ability for students to manage their time is going to be critical. So I think getting our students to understand that they don't need us to control them, but they have the ability to control themselves, and we can provide some parameters for students is a great way to move towards. But it's not something I generally will start with. I will always start with, say, a fixed and structured type of activity before I move on to the free and open. And some students don't necessarily make that transition, and other students are quicker. And I'm okay if I've got multiple students. I can just keep the rotation schedule going, and some students know that they don't follow it, and some students know that they do. And that seems to work pretty well for most cases in my room. So I hope this was informative and got your ideas flowing about how you could structure centers in a junior classroom, perhaps a little bit differently than you have, say, in primary or you've seen done before. Using centers in flexible ways is going to allow you to get more done because you can be more responsive to student need. You don't have to worry in a flexible or even free, structured, or open model. Students don't have the I'm done now what problem because there's always an activity that they can move on to. There's always something else that can be done. When you have more of a free, open model, students just move on to the next activity instead of sitting and waiting and completing, say, busy work while they wait for the rest of their classmates to catch up, and then generally become a management problem at the same time. So sometimes a flexible or free, open model allows you to avoid the "I'm done, I don't have anything to do, what do I do now?" problem in your classroom. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope this is giving you some food for thought as to how you can structure and run centers in your classroom. And I hope that you stay tuned all this week in the Teaching Junior Grades with Madly Learning Facebook group, because I have lots of things coming for you that all relate to how to structure guided reading in junior grades, how to conference with your students, and even how to group them into different types of grouping based on their ability and mixed ability groupings. So all of that is coming up this week for you in the Teaching Junior Grades with Madly Learning Facebook group. Now, for those of you that are interested in learning how to set up your literacy program minute to minute, day to day, week to week, month to month, I have a free masterclass that I want to walk you through all of those steps so that you can plan a highly effective language arts program that you can implement from day one. So if you are interested in joining this masterclass where I will walk you through how to plan and schedule your highly effective language arts program, regardless of the kind of teaching September brings, then please go to www.ignitedliteracy.com. So thank you so much for joining me, and we will see you all throughout the week talking all about independent work during your literacy program this week in the Teaching with Junior Grades by Madly Learning Facebook group. Bye for now.